I'm here with Jez Humble. Jez is the author of Continuous Delivery. It's a seminal book on the topic. Jez, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me.
Jez, if there's a Taylor Swift of continuous delivery, it's probably you. Would you agree with that?
That's very flattering. Thank you.
You've been at this a very long time. Can you talk a little bit about how did you first get interested in this topic?
So I first got interested in around 2005 when I was an independent contractor who joined a company called ThoughtWorks. And I've been working in small companies where we would deploy routinely from workstations into production, and it was super easy. We just used FTP. And I joined ThoughtWorks, and we were working on big projects where it would take months to get software into production. And I was actually on a team of 8 people whose job was to get software into even a test environment that was production-like, and that would take days or weeks. And so that team and a number of other teams working at ThoughtWorks who were having similar problems produced a whole bunch of ideas and techniques to help facilitate the process of getting software live. And those ideas are what's written up in the Continuous Delivery book that me and Dave Farley wrote back in 2010.
And what have you learned since then?
It's been a fascinating journey. I mean, we set out to write quite a boring niche book on test and deployment automation. And by the time it came out in 2010, there was a whole movement behind it. The DevOps movement had, the first DevOps Days conference was in 2009. Velocity conference, we'd seen John Allspaw and Paul Hammond's presentation, 10 plus deploys a day at Flickr. There was Eric Ries and the lean startup movement talking about continuous deployment. And so I think, that there was a whole bunch of different movements that converged on solving this problem, basically. And I think what we've learned then is that it's not a niche problem. It's a problem that everyone has. And it's a problem that everyone can do something about. We've seen since then people succeed at applying these ideas in all kinds of domains, whether it's hardware, embedded systems, through obviously to network companies, but also in highly regulated environments. So, for example, I've seen people do continuous delivery on mainframe systems in the insurance industry. Suncorp in Australia is a great example of that. I worked in the US federal government in 2016, where the team that I was working on applied these techniques in government. We built a platform as a service using continuous delivery principles that's able to host government regulated information systems. So I think, what we discovered basically is that this stuff can and does work everywhere.
My finding, Jez, is that the big problem with getting to a strong practice of continuous delivery is less about people agreeing or disagreeing it's a good idea and more about committing adequate time, energy, and focus to it. Would you agree with that, or have you found otherwise?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's hard, and it takes a great deal of effort. And the further away you are from it, and the bigger and more complex your systems are, the more work it's going to be to get you there. And most organizations, especially large organizations, there's a lot of focus on getting the work done. And continuous delivery is about process improvement. And lots of organizations just don't allocate sufficient resources to process improvement. And it's not given sufficient importance. And it's hard to think about the ROI of it and measure it. And so really it is just a question of getting focused, consistent effort on that process improvement work that's necessary to enable these ideas and these outcomes.
So for companies that you've seen kind of stuck in that one place and then move to investing adequately or sufficiently to get this going, how do they make that transition from A to B? Or what external thing makes them want to go do that?
I mean, this is always the first question I ask is, why are you interested in this? And there's normally a range of answers from, just wanting to get faster, wanting to deliver stuff faster, but also people wanting to improve quality and people wanting to improve other outcomes and reduce costs. So knowing why you want to do it is I think, the most important thing. And then I think how you do it is incrementally and piece by piece, in the same way that we want to move away from big bang releases. We also want to move away from big bang organizational transformation and think about, well, here's the outcome. It may take us years to achieve that across the whole organization. What piece can we pick off that will quickly give us some measurable improvement for some part of our systems and some part of our organization where we can demonstrate an measurable improvement towards the outcome that we care about, the business outcome we care about, and that will help us learn, because the first time you try and do this, you're going to make a bunch of mistakes, and you have to keep going in the face of that and then take those learnings and propagate them throughout the organization.
Jez, I'm old. In the engineering world, there used to be this proposition that if there's fast, cheap, and good, you always have to pick two of those things and accept that. Has continuous delivery changed that, or is that still the same?
I think in some way it's changed the game. And I think, as an engineer, you're used to thinking of trade-offs. And most of the time you do have trade-offs. This is one of those cases where I think it's possible to break that trade-off. I've been involved in a research program with Dr. Nicole Forsker and Gene Kim for the last 4 years, investigating DevOps. And we have a large amount of data. And what we find consistently every year is that high performers are doing better at both speed and stability. So they're not actually trading off faster for lower quality or less stability. They're actually getting better at all of these things. And when you look at the practices at the heart of continuous delivery, you can see how they enable both outcomes. Being able to, for example, version control the configuration of your environments, that helps you both with speed, because it enables you to provision testing environments on demand and get fast feedback from testing. And it also helps you with stability, because it helps you validate that your software is going to work in a production-like environment throughout the delivery process. It helps you with disaster recovery if you want to be able to provision a disaster recovery environment in a repeatable, low variability amount of time. So these techniques really help you with quality and speed and stability. And on the cost thing, they are expensive to implement. So there's no doubt that it's going to take you time and money to implement these things, but you amortize that cost on the back end. If you're building a bit of software that's never going to change, maybe it's not worth it. If you're going to build a piece of software, it is going to change over its life cycle, and you're going to need to keep changing it and evolving it. That's where you can amortize this cost over the back end, and it really pays off. And I think that reflects a big shift we've seen in the industry away from these kind of big software projects where you build it and you release it and then it never changes, to a more product-focused attitude where we're building products that will continue to evolve over a long life cycle. And I think continuous delivery is one of the key pieces that changes when you move from that project focus to a product focus.
For the team that's making their way through the evolution of this practice, can you talk a little bit about the relationship between continuous integration and continuous delivery?
Yeah, absolutely. So continuous integration is a practice that goes back to the 90s. In fact, Microsoft was doing daily builds for Windows, I believe, back in the 90s. And then the XP movement, Kent Beck and people working on those early XP projects were doing regular builds and doing builds every time they made a commit, ultimately, and running tests. So that's a practice that goes back a long way. Continuous delivery is about saying, well, it's not good enough to have a build. We have to make sure that the software is actually releasable at all times, that we could actually push a release out to production, or in the case of mobile or user-installed products, into the hands of users at any time, that the software is always in a deployable state. And in particular, that we get rid of this kind of last mile where it takes, the software's that we have a build that's good, but it's going to take us, a month to deploy it to production. We get rid of that. We build that into the daily work of everyone. We make sure that every build is actually not just, passing the test, but actually deployable at all times, and that we could press a button at any time during business hours and deploy into production. So that's really the difference.
And for our learner who, say, is an individual contributor on a team, or maybe a team lead, and they want to manage upwards to get a little bit of time and space and maybe money to initiate this practice, what would you advise them to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one I get asked a lot. I think, ideally, in an ideal world, you would have leadership support on achieving the outcomes that continuous delivery helps you to achieve. And that would, give you the time and the money in order to invest in doing this in a disciplined and visible and consistent way. Where that's not possible, I think I like to quote Rear Admiral Grace Hopper, who says, ask forgiveness, not permission, and try and find ways to do kind of guerrilla continuous delivery. One of the projects I like to reference that did this really well was a project on firmware. They didn't ask for extra budget for implementing test automation. They just did it. It was part of your daily work. And I think just having a team where everyone agrees, well, listen, making sure that the software builds and passes the tests and that we're writing automated tests and that we have an automated deploy process, that's just basic engineering discipline. And we're just going to do it. And we're not going to ask people for permission to make sure that we can do that. We're just going to do it. And hopefully you've got like at least the level of management support you need in order to be able to do that. And you have to be careful because, if you're in a brownfield project where there's already a whole bunch of stuff, that can be a very expensive investment. And I think you do have to be pragmatic about it and say, well, listen, we're not going to get all the way there in the next week, but we're going to allocate a certain amount of our capacity every week to improving and to doing this stuff and make sure new work that we do follows these principles.
You talked about management having a set of outcomes they want and that hopefully clearing the way for the investability of this. How would you measure good practice? What does high performance specifically look like in this area?
So there's 4 measures that we found to be valid and reliable in our research program over the last 4 years. In terms of measuring software delivery performance, you can go and read, sorry, just excuse me 1 second here. You showed one of my books at the beginning of this section. This is the most recent one, quick plug for my most recent book, Accelerate, where we talk about this research program. In that book, you can read about these 4 measures. There's 2 throughput measures. One is lead time from commit into version control to software in production. So how long does that take? Is that on demand, or is it hours or days or weeks? The second one is deploy frequency. How frequently do we deploy? Do we deploy once every 6 months, once every month, once every couple of weeks? So those are the 2 throughput metrics. And then there's 2 stability metrics. One is time to restore service. When you have an incident in production, how long does it take to remediate that and restore full quality of service? And then the second stability metric is change fail rate. So when you push a change into production, what proportion of the time does that succeed versus fail and require remediation? So that is, if you like, a quality metric for your release process. And again, just to emphasize, what we find is that the high performers do better at all of those things. They're not trading off speed for stability. They're doing better at both. So those are some good metrics that I think are proven and validated that you might want to start with.
And just for the avoidance of doubt, when you say deploy, that's deploying to production, deploying to real users.
Yeah, absolutely. Not just deploying to a test environment, deploying to production to users. Yes.
In terms of cultivating this capability, I sometimes see this kind of Wizard of Oz problem, like where the scarecrow doesn't believe that it can, that it has a brain or whatever. And there's this idea that, well, we don't know how to do this, so we have to get somebody else to come in and do this for us. How do you create an environment that encourages that kind of organic growth of this practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and it's a really difficult problem. And I think it really cuts to the heart of what I and others have seen in the field. This idea that, well, these ideas are great, but they won't work here because, we're special and unique. And I think it's first important to acknowledge that everyone is special and unique. It's true. You can't just take what other people have done and copy it and expect it to have the same results. That won't work. You have to forge your own path. And I think the important thing to bear in mind is, I've been in this field probably not as long as you, but certainly since 2000. I've seen so much change, and we're all making it up as we go along. Working in the federal government, I actually had a sticker on my laptop which says, winging it. We're all making it up as we go along. And I think the thing to bear in mind is, we're all in the same boat. Things are changing so fast. No one was talking about Kubernetes 5 years ago. Now everyone's talking about it. It's not like it emerged fully formed from the head of Zeus and everyone knew how to do it. We're all making it up. And so the important thing to bear in mind is you're in the same boat as everyone else. It's not like, you know, I'm some genius who was born with this knowledge. I got where I am by a process of trial and error and trying to fix problems as I saw them and treating them as obstacles to be overcome rather than as objections to say, well, you know, this is just the way it is, we can't get better. And that really is all there is to it. It's just problem solving. And I think the culture piece that you highlight is really important. And this is one of the most important jobs of leadership and management, is how do we build a culture where it's okay to do that and to problem solve and not to know the answers in advance, but to go and do it anyway and to fail a bunch of times and for that to be okay, and to create an environment where the failures aren't catastrophic. In other words, you know, they don't lead to huge amounts of waste or, you know, catastrophic outcomes. How do we make those failures small and contained and fast so that we can learn really quickly and make it safe for people to do that and give them resources they need to do that?
That is some fantastic perspective and super practical. Thanks, Jez, for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure.